In this video, we're going to take a quick look at kings and queens of England, Britain and the UK, ranging from the Wessex king Egbert, who was crowned in 802, right the way up to the current king, Charles III, who was crowned 1,221 years later. Before we get on to Egbert though, let's take a brief look at what came before. More than 2,000 years ago, Britain was occupied by several relatively small Celtic tribes. Then, in 43 AD, the Romans arrived, and they stayed for around 370 years before leaving. After that, the Anglo-Saxons arrived and established several rival kingdoms. These kingdoms existed for around 400 years before one, Wessex, emerged dominant. The aforementioned Egbert was one of the last in a long line of Wessex kings. Born in 770, he ruled from 802 to 839. We're starting with him because he won an important victory against the then dominant kingdom of Mercia, and so he set the train in motion for the dominance of Wessex, which in turn produced the first English kings. He was succeeded by his son Ethelwulf, who ruled from 839 to 858, and was the father of one of England's most famous early kings, Alfred the Great. Alfred was his youngest son though, so before he could take over, his older brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert and Ethelred, ruled as Wessex kings between 858 and 871. Alfred himself ruled from 871 to 899. Alfred's famous because at the time the Vikings had defeated most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and had almost turned England into their own fiefdom. They'd already established Danelaw in the north, and were close to completely overwhelming Wessex and ridding England of Anglo-Saxon kings once and for all. Alfred stopped them. His son, Edward the Elder, who ruled from 899 to 924, defeated the Vikings, conquering the southern part of Danelaw. Edward's son Ethelstan, who ruled from 924 to 939, is our first king of the English, and obtained that title after conquering Danelaw, sending the Vikings packing and uniting all Anglo-Saxons. Ethelstan didn't produce an heir, so he was followed by his brother Edmund I, who ruled from 939 to 946, and who initially lost part of the north of his kingdom before regaining it. Edmund did produce a male heir called Edwig, but at 6 years of age he was too young to take the crown. So instead, Edmund's brother Edred reigned next, from 946 to 955. After Edred died, Edwig took over the reins, ruling from 955 until 959. Edwig is famous for having fallen out with the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. Edwig didn't produce an heir, so Edmund I's son came next. Edgar the Peaceful ruled from 959 to 975, and he's famous for being the father of two English kings, Edward and Ethelred. Edward, styled Edward the Martyr, ruled from 975 to 978, but was brutally murdered at the age of about 16 after he was stabbed sitting on top of his horse. The murderer was never captured, and there were rumours that his stepmother was behind it. After all, Edward's death meant that his half-brother, her son Ethelred, succeeded to the throne. Ethelred the Unready, as he came to be known, ruled from 978 to 1016. He dealt with renewed Viking raids by paying them off rather than fighting them. He also paved the way for the 1066 Norman invasion by marrying Emma of Normandy. She was William the Conqueror's great-aunt, something that would enable William to later claim that he had a legitimate right to sit on the English throne. Though Ethelred ruled until 1016, in 1013 the King of Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard, invaded, partly in revenge, after his sister was killed in a massacre ordered by Ethelred. Sweyn had himself crowned King of England and ruled for 41 days in 1013 before dying. This allowed Ethelred to return, and he ruled until 1016. Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside ruled next in 1016. Unfortunately, throughout his short reign, he was forced to fight Sweyn Forkbeard's son Canute for the crown, and he died after just 7 months, possibly of battle wounds. After that, the way was open for Canute, who reigned from 1016 to 1035. Canute was a learned man, and is known for having ordered the tide back. The sea washed over his feet, proving his point that kings were not infallible. Canute's son Harold Harefoot reigned after he died, from 1035 to 1040. Then, Canute's other son Harthacnut ruled until 1042, before keeling over at a friend's wedding and dying. Next, Ethelred the Unready's son by Emma of Normandy sat on the throne. Edward the Confessor would be the last king from Egbert's House of Wessex dynasty, and he ruled from 1042 to 1066. A devoted religious man who was later venerated as a saint, Edward ended his reign childless, and he's supposed to have nominated William the Conqueror as his successor. Instead of William taking over, though, a powerful Wessex earl, Harold Godwinson, stole a march, had himself crowned and ruled for 9 months in 1066. Harold would be the last Anglo-Saxon king to rule. Having reportedly been promised the crown by Edward the Confessor, the Duke of Normandy swooped into England and defeated him at the Battle of Hastings, changing England's destiny forever by installing a new Norman regime and ruling from 1066 until 1087. William the Conqueror's son, William Rufus, or William II, ruled next from 1087 until 1100, when he was shot through his lung with an arrow whilst out hunting. After that, Rufus's younger brother was crowned Henry I, and he ruled from 1100 to 1135. His son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving him without an heir. Henry tried to install his daughter Matilda as his successor. Matilda had married into a powerful Anjou family, something that would later lead to a dynasty of Plantagenet kings. When Henry died, though, his nephew Stephen stole in ahead of her and had himself crowned king, plunging England into a civil war as Matilda fought to claim the throne. Stephen ruled from 1135 to 1154, and he's the first of our kings to have been placed in prison after being captured by Matilda's forces, though he was later released. He was succeeded by Matilda's son, who ruled as Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings, from 1154 to 1189, expanding his empire into Ireland and deeper into France, but also causing a crisis when his men murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. Henry's son Richard ruled next, from 1189 to 1199. He was the crusading king who led forces against the mighty Saladin during the Third Crusade to reconquer Jerusalem. He was also captured and handed over to a rival European monarch and spent 14 months in jail before being freed. Having produced no children, Richard I was succeeded by his brother John, who ruled from 1199 to 1216. John lost his father's lands in France and developed such a bad historical reputation it would lead him to be cast as the villain in the Robin Hood legends. John also fell out with his nobles, who forced him to sign Magna Carta, a legal document cited today as a touchstone for all modern freedoms. John's son ruled next as Henry III from 1216 to 1272. Like father, like son, Henry annoyed the English barons by favouring French courtiers and proved fairly useless on the battlefield. The barons forced him to sign the Provisions of Oxford, which created a council of advisers to oversee the king's administration. Henry III's son Edward ruled next from 1272 to 1307. Edward I proved more effective and is credited for having accepted the barons' reforms and for calling the first ever representative parliament to help him rule. However, Edward I has a terrible historical reputation, as he's also known for stripping Jews of their property and expelling them from England, and for suppressing Scottish revolts and killing the Scottish independence warrior William Wallace. Edward's son ruled next from 1307 to 1327. Styled Edward II, he proved unpopular with the barons after promoting his friend, possibly his lover, Piers Gaveston. He was also routed by the Scots under Robert the Bruce at the famous Battle of Bannockburn, which secured Scottish independence. Edward's resentful wife ran into the arms of her lover, Roger Mortimer, whose forces invaded England and toppled the king. Edward was imprisoned and, it's rumoured, tortured and killed. His son, Edward III, ruled next for an incredible 50 years, from 1327 to 1377. Though the Black Death devastated England, killing up to 40% of the population, his reign is considered a success. Edward III restored royal authority and led England into the 100 Years' War with France, winning important victories at Crécy and Poitiers. Edward III's son died too soon to be king, so instead the crown passed to Edward III's grandson, Richard II, who ruled from 1377 to 1399. Richard II was only 10 when he became king, so Edward III's other son, John of Gaunt, took the reins initially, helping the young king through major challenges such as the continuation of the 100 Years' War and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Richard later fell out with and exiled John of Gaunt's son, his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Seeking revenge, Henry invaded England, deposed Richard, and had himself crowned King Henry IV. Henry IV, who ruled from 1399 to 1413, might have stabilised the monarchy, but overthrowing King Richard II would later lead to the War of the Roses. Henry's son ruled next as Henry V from 1413 to 1422. Henry V is known for his prowess on the battlefield, leading his English army in a stunning victory over the French at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, and coming very close to conquering the whole of France. Henry V was succeeded by his 9-month-old son, who was crowned Henry VI, and who ruled from 1422 to 1471. Thanks to his father's successors, he was also crowned King of France, though he was eventually dethroned there, and the war with France started again. Domestic troubles led to poor Henry VI having a series of mental breakdowns, culminating in the War of the Roses, which resulted in him being deposed by the son of his cousin Richard, the Duke of York, who had himself crowned Edward IV. Though Henry VI was eventually restored to the throne, Edward IV IV killed his son and heir and placed the ailing king in the Tower of London, where he's thought to have been murdered. All this means that our next king, Edward IV, had 2 reigns, from 1461 to 1470, and then again after Henry VI was reinstated and then died, from 1471 to 1483. His 12-year-old son would subsequently reign as Edward V for just 11 weeks in 1483, before being disappeared by his uncle and protector, the dastardly Richard III, who would himself rule from 1483 until 1485. Richard III's reign culminated with the invasion of England by a distant claimant to the English throne from the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenet family. Henry, who had himself crowned after Richard III was slain at the Battle of Bosworth, crowned Henry VII, who ruled England from 1485 to 1509 and established one of England's most famous ruling dynasties, the Tudors. Having stabilised the kingdom, Henry VII passed the crown to his son Henry VIII, who, during his 38-year reign from 1509 to 1547, famously married 6 wives, executing 2 of them, in a bid to produce a male heir. He also initiated the English Reformation and separated the Church of England from the Catholic Church in the process. He was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, who ruled from 1547 until his untimely death in 1553, aged just 15. In that short time, the young king made his mark by reinforcing the independence of the Church of England. These efforts were undermined by his older half-sister, who reigned next from 1553 to 1558 as Mary I. Mary I became known as Bloody Mary for attempting to return England to the Catholic fold and for sending dissenters to be burnt at the stake. She was succeeded by her half-sister, the Virgin Queen, the mighty Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603. Elizabeth reversed Mary's attempts to re-establish Catholicism in England. During her reign, so famous it was named the Elizabethan Age, the Spanish Armada was defeated, the English forces inspired by a stirring speech she delivered on the eve of battle, and English literature and poetry flourished, especially under the penmanship of one William Shakespeare. Elizabeth produced no children, so she was succeeded by James I, the great-great-grandson of a previous King of England, Henry VII. James I, the first of the Stuarts, was already King of Scotland when he came to the English throne in 1603, and so he ruled both kingdoms until 1625. During James's reign, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, a plan by English Catholics led by Robert Catesby, working with Guy Fawkes to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, was thwarted. James was succeeded by his son, who reigned as Charles I from 1625 until his execution in London in 1649. Charles was an unpopular king who tried to rule without parliamentary oversight. On top of that, he had a Catholic wife, and his failure to provide aid to Protestant forces during the 30 Years' War in Europe fostered suspicions about where his loyalties lay. In 1642, the English Civil War broke out, pitting Roundhead parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell against Royalist cavaliers. Charles was defeated in 1645 and executed 4 years later. For the first time, England didn't have a king. A Commonwealth of England was established before the Roundhead general Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector from 1653 until 1658. As well as being a very capable military leader, Cromwell is also known for his intolerance of Catholics and for the atrocities he carried out in Ireland. He was succeeded as Lord Protector by his son, Richard Cromwell, who was weak and ineffectual, and spent just 8 months in office until 1659, when a Council of State was established to oversee the running of England until Charles I's son could be brought back and crowned king. He was, and England became a monarchy-led country again. Charles II reigned from 1660 until 1685. This period of history is known as the Restoration and is characterised by a sense of relief that England was back on a steady course after the Civil War and by the music, art and literature which flourished at the time. Though he was a bad administrator, he was known as the Merry Monarch and even became a people's hero for his personal involvement in trying to save London from the Great Fire of 1666. Despite having 13 children, none were legitimate, so he was succeeded to the throne by his younger brother James, who ruled from 1685 to 1688. A Catholic, James II was unpopular and deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 when leading members of the English political class invited his daughter Mary and her husband, Dutch Protestant William of Orange, to invade England and take the crown. William and Mary helped to secure England's status as a Protestant parliamentary democracy. The couple didn't produce any children, so they were succeeded by the daughter of James II, who ruled as Queen Anne from 1702 to 1714. During her reign, the Acts of Union were signed, merging England and Scotland into a single sovereign state, Great Britain. Anne was the last monarch from the House of Stuart and died without an heir. She was succeeded by her second cousin, her closest living Protestant relative from the House of Hanover, George I, who ruled from 1714 to 1727. Under George I, Britain began the steady transition from a country led by a king to one led by members of Parliament. notably Robert Walpole, recognised as Great Britain's first Prime Minister. George's son, George II, reigned next. Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Stuart pretender to the throne, attempted to overthrow George II in the last Jacobite uprising of 1745. The rebellion failed. George II's son, Frederick, was due to inherit the crown, but died in 1751. So instead, Frederick's son was crowned next and styled George III. He ruled for an incredible 60 years, from 1760 right the way through to 1820. George III is perhaps best remembered as the king who lost Britain's American colonies in the American War of Independence. Also during his reign, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo and the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in 1807. George III is also thought to have suffered from a severe mental illness, allowing his son to step in as Prince Regent. George IV eventually graduated from Prince Regent to King. He built Buckingham Palace and presided over the emergence of the British Empire as a dominant world force. George's only legitimate child, Charlotte, died before him in 1817, so when he himself died, he was succeeded by his younger brother William, who reigned as William IV from 1830 to 1837. William IV inherited the throne when he was 64 and had led a full life before then. He'd served in the Royal Navy, was known as the Sailor King, and cohabited with an actress with whom he'd had several children. William was succeeded by one of the most famous monarchs in British history, Queen Victoria. Victoria reigned from 1837 right the way through to 1901 and presided over a period of industrial, scientific and cultural change, the likes of which had never been seen before in Britain or the world. Victoria was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, who reigned from 1901 to 1910. After Edward, or Bertie as he was nicknamed, came George V, who sat on the throne from 1910 to 1936. During World War I, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was deemed too German-sounding and so was changed to the House of Windsor. George V was succeeded by his eldest son, Edward VIII, who sat on the throne for less than a year. Edward VIII is famous for having abdicated so that he could marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson. When he stepped down, he was succeeded by his younger brother, George VI, who reigned from 1936 until his death in 1952. George VI is remembered for his radio broadcasts, which boosted morale with the British public during World War II. George's eldest daughter, Elizabeth II, reigned next. She was crowned in 1953 and in 2015 became the longest-serving monarch in history. Elizabeth II presided over some huge changes in the 20th and 21st centuries, from the dissolution of the British Empire to the Cold War. In 2022, she was succeeded by her eldest son, Charles, who was crowned Charles III in 2023.